Welcome back, everybody. This is East Broad Top Video Part 4. We are doing the rest of the tour in the next few parts, I think. Enjoy!
Alright folks, we're going to get started here. My name is Al. I'm going to be giving the tour here today. How this is going to work, we're going to be in here for about 10 to 15 minutes while I go over some safety and some history. Then we'll get on over to the first three stalls of the roundhouse, and then on over to the machine shop. Any questions on that game plan, folks?
No, thank you. I'm good.
No questions. Wonderful. Now, I did promise a little bit of safety here. Well, as pretty much all of you have already experienced, we are an active railroad. People often ask, where's the museum? And the answer is there isn't one unless you're referring to the Rock Hill Trolley Museum. The East Broad Top Railroad is more of a living history experience and exhibit and active railroad. As a result, we have a lot of safety guidelines we need you to follow, and it is imperative that you follow them. Number one, when we cross the tracks today, we're going to be crossing a lot of tracks today. We're going to be going from one side to the other of 7 tracks here in the yard, as well as a couple more throughout the shop complex. When we go across those tracks, we're going from one side to the other, and we are not stopping in the middle. The reason being, our train crew may need to move something, our mechanical department may need to move something, and equipment, regardless of that, can move for any reason at any time in any direction. And it's our job to not be in the way. So folks, when we walk across those tracks, we're going from one side to the other. Please do not stop in the middle to take any pictures. Additionally, when we go across those tracks, we have a couple more safety guidelines we need you to follow because I don't feel like filling out any paperwork here today. And that is, when you step across those rails, please step between the rail. Do not step on it. Reason is, steel rail is surprisingly slippery. And as a result, you could slip, trip, or fall. And I really don't want that happening to you because it creates a not very fun tour for you and a lot of paperwork for me. And I really don't feel like doing paperwork today. Additionally, for the younger in the audience, or the young at heart, I have to include you as well. Please no balance beaming on the rail to impress your friends, siblings, colleagues, or parents. Why? Well, you could slip, trip, or fall, and I do not want that happening to you, as I mentioned earlier. Now, folks, because we are an active railroad, we have several very nice, very open pits. We have an ash pit, a turntable pit, and every single locomotive you're going to see today, guess what, has a pit underneath of it.
The locomotive.
Folks, I hate to break your hearts. The pits are not part of the tour, and no, you cannot pay extra to go in them. All right? A good rule of thumb with that is, if you're getting closer to a pit than I am getting, guess what? You are getting too close. Additionally, if you see wooden planking or metal grating, especially over in the roundhouse and machine shop, guess what it's covering?
A pit.
A pit. Therefore, don't step on it. I don't want you falling into the pit. Additionally, folks, 2 final things here. Throughout our tour today, I'm going to need you to stick together as a group. You're a little bit of a larger group, which is no big deal. I just need you to stick together and keep walking with me as we keep walking. And on top of that, please do not attempt to climb on or operate any of the equipment you see here today. The reason is we leave that to our paid train crews as well as our mechanical department. Why? Well, they're paid and trained to do that. Unfortunately, I cannot let you up in the cabs of any of the engines for a quick cab picture. All right? We all good on the safety stuff, folks?
Yeah.
All right. How this is going to work, we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes of history here. It depends on how fast I talk. As we do, if you have any questions, I welcome you to have them. Just please hold them to the end. Reason is, either A, I'm about to answer it, or B, it at least helps the flow of the presentation go a little bit smoother. And then after that, we'll get over to the roundhouse and then over to the machine shop. Alrighty? Alrighty, folks. On that note, I'm going to take us back to 1872. That is when the East Broad Top Railroad was starting up here in Mount Union at the interchange with the Pennsylvania Railroad and began building south through the Ogwick Valley, so named because of the Ogwick Creek. They really like reusing some names here. Until 1873. By that time, they reached the west bank across the creek from Orbisonia in a little tiny town called Rock Hill Furnace. Now, Rock Hill Furnace was named because of the Rock Hill family of iron masters. And folks, that family owned a bunch of little tiny furnaces in the area, and they produced roughly 40 to 50 tons of iron a year. Well, As you can see by the picture, they were getting set to combine them into one big furnace. And that big furnace was going to produce 100 tons of iron a day. Kind of a very significant increase. And they very quickly realized that the charcoal they had been using wasn't really going to be the most cost-effective way to go, because 2 days into production, they probably would have run out of logs to turn into charcoal. But the railroad already knew that, and they actually kept production going, or construction going at least, down through the towns of Pope, Three Springs, and Saltillo, where the railroad reached the base of the Broad Top Mountain and began climbing the east side of it. Wait a minute, East and Broad Top, that makes a pretty good name for a railroad, doesn't it? Well, folks, that is how our railroad got its name. And they climbed that Broad Top Mountain of a 2.7% grade through 2 tunnels and a bunch of twisty curves until they reached the towns of Robertsdale, Woodvale, and Alvin. And the reason they wanted to reach there was because that was the site of a very nice semi-bituminous coal vein. That semi-bituminous coal was a semi-soft coal, and it was very clean burning. It was about partway between bituminous and anthracite. And when the railroad reached there in 1874, they began mining that coal, and it became a coal conveyor belt, at least in a large form, taking coal off the mountain down to the iron furnace. And then at the iron furnace, they would make pig iron and export it out to Mount Union, 11 miles that way. And that functioned pretty well for the railroad for a little bit. But there was a tiny little bit of foreshadowing here, because some of that coal actually went to Mount Union. Not for interchange though. Back then it was for use in one of the 3 brick plants in Mount Union, which is why Mount Union became known as a brick town. Well, these brick plants made a very special kind of brick. It was called fire brick. And this fire brick was used in the blast furnaces of steel mills all the way out in Pittsburgh. So with a tiny bit of irony, and yes, the pun is definitely intended, the railroad was partially responsible for the closure of the Rock Hill Iron Furnace in 1908. And that created a little bit of a problem. The railroad's main way of making money, well, it was gone now.
Iron.
Well, there's also a secondary problem cropping up at this point, because at this time, all the railroad's old freight cars were made out of wood, and were 40 years old at this point, meaning they were starting to fall apart. So the railroad board of directors went to the operating vice president at the time, a gentleman by the name of Robert Seibert. And they went to him because he had made his knowledge and money running railroads out west, and had come back to work here as operating vice president. And they went to him saying, Mr. Seibert, we need you to get us making money again. Oh, and by the way, while you're at it, if it's not too much trouble, could you modernize all of our equipment too, please? But don't worry, Mr. Seibert, we're not going to make this impossible on you. We are going to give you a blank check to do it. That blank check really did help, because he was responsible for the expansion of the shop complex we're going to see today. He was responsible for ordering the construction of over 300 steel freight cars, which at the time was the only steel freight car fleet on the narrow gauge. And all that construction took place in the car shop next to that shop complex we're going to see today. And he was responsible for ordering the construction and delivery of the 6 Baldwin 282 Mikado steam locomotives, all 6 of which are still here to this day. And depending on how things are positioned, you'll get to at least see 4 of them. Now, folks, this modernization happened pretty darn immediately, because one of the very first decisions Seibert made happened in 1908, right after that iron furnace closed. The reason it happened that soon is they had to keep making money. So what they did, if I can find the picture, because they keep reordering them on me, was build a great big coal washing plant in the middle of the Mount Union yard. And that coal washing plant was pretty darn nice for our railroad. In fact, it was very efficient. We could take our little narrow gauge hopper, which you can see on the left-hand side of that picture, dump it out into the plant, send all the coal up into the plant, and then it would get sifted by size, get all the debris and bony out of it, and then go into whatever standard gauge hopper it needed to go into. I mentioned it was very efficient because our railroad's part of it was done in roughly 30 seconds. Wow. Because as soon as that hopper was empty, we could send it right back up the mountain to get more coal. However, there was still a tiny issue. And it was with what was known as less than carload freight. Or to put it in a modern context, all those packages that FedEx, UPS, and the Postal Service deliver to your house. Back in those days, you had those Sears and Roebuck catalog. And you would write to the catalog saying, I really like this couch, here's the item number, here's the check to pay for it. And you would send it off. And you would wait a little bit. And a little bit more. And probably a little bit more. And if you're really unlucky, probably a little bit more. Until eventually you got a telegram saying, hey, your couch is at your local freight office, please come pick it up, it's taking up space. So you would come here with your horse and wagon or your pickup truck, depending on how much money you made, and you would sign for your couch, you would load it up, and take it on home. It was very much the Amazon Prime shipping of its day, folks. Though, as you can probably imagine, it did not take 2 days. And part of the reason for that was up in Mount Union. You had to interchange all the freight out of a standard gauge boxcar into 2 narrow gauge ones. Because our narrow gauge cars, in addition to being a narrow gauge, a smaller distance between the rails, were also about 3/4 the size physically of a standard gauge car. That process took 5 guys about 4 hours, which wasn't very efficient because for those 4 hours, those cars could be making money doing something else. And this is where a little known logging railroad inadvertently saves the day. Because the McKelvey Brothers Logging Company, and they changed the order of the pictures on me again, was actually logging Black Log Mountain, out behind where the iron furnace used to be, and where the Trolley Museum actually sits right now. And they were really good at their jobs. They started in 1924. And when they started, they very quickly realized that paying a crew of guys to hand transfer logs from one car to another was not the most efficient thing to do. Why? Well, it would take that crew of guys all day to do one car. So they built a gantry structure in the Mount Union Yard, and as you can see by the picture, it had a chain on it. And that chain would get wrapped around a bundle of logs, and the logs would get lifted up off the narrow gauge car and transferred on over to the standard gauge one. Now folks, this is where I have to issue a warning that railroaders are very imaginative when it comes to naming things. Because this structure, as you may have already summarized by the picture, became known as the timber transfer. So named because it transferred timber from one car to another. Folks, next time you come and take a train ride with us, ask our train crew why a Y is called a Y. They really love that question. But this worked really well for McKelvey Brothers. It worked so well, in fact, that by 1927, just 3 years later, they had run out of logs to log on top of Black Log Mountain and went bust. So they ripped up their tracks, took their little 2-truck narrow gauge shaves, and went off to a different valley to go make money elsewhere. But they left the timber transfer behind. And a few years later, in the early 30s, the railroad realized that they could use it. Not to transfer logs anymore, though. That business had pretty much dried up. But what they could do was stiffen some of the structure, modernize some of the components, and use it to lift up one end of a standard gauge car, roll out the standard gauge truck, roll in the narrow gauge truck, set the car back down, and do the same thing to the other side. And all of a sudden, that 5-guy, 4-hour process I mentioned took 5 guys 30 minutes, and had effectively turned a standard gauge car into a narrow gauge one. Now, folks, this almost single-handedly saved the carload-based freight business for the railroad. In fact, it was so lucrative that later on in the 30s, they got a contract to take standard gauge cars on material out one of the branch lines. It was known as the Shade Gap Branch. The Trolley Museum actually runs on 2 miles of it, heading out to 522. Well, it used to go further, out to its namesake town of Shade Gap, and even further on still, down to a town called Neelyton. At Neelyton, these cars would be unloaded for use in the construction of a little-known highway called the Pennsylvania Turnpike. What was ultimately a short-term boom for the railroad ultimately helped lead to its demise, though. Because all this newfangled road traffic wiped out what little passenger business our railroad had by 1954, and by 1956, the coal market was kind of going the same way. People were using oil to heat their homes now. Ships have been using oil for fuel for a while. And finally, that third and final brick plant in Mount Union did not close down. All 3 of them were still there, but it had converted its drying kiln from coal fire to natural gas fire. thus removing the online customer for the coal, which meant in April of 1956, our railroad couldn't make money anymore and was promptly sold to a scrap dealer after closing down. If you know anything about railroads, that's usually the end of the story. But folks, there is a hero to our story, because obviously we're here today. And I want to tell you about him, but I want to tell you about him over in the Roundhouse. So folks, this is where I ask, are there any questions? Seeing none, either you're all confused or I did a great job. Regardless of which one it is, I'm going to ask that you stand up and meet me down at the bottom of the stairs here.
Well, I for the next time. I was gonna ask if they did actually do revenue free today. Brian got that.
Looks like Big Bird got ran over.
Oh my god. It does. You're not
It
wrong.
really does. Big Bird shouldn't have been playing on the tracks.
I have a bad habit of tripping up the stairs. I usually don't trip down, but I'll trip up. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is an award. If you know how to run a locomotive, you could get one. Well, they stopped doing it because we're too big.
Those exact photos. The best book overall about the railroad is a book called East Broad by Grady and Fred Piper. Occasionally they have a copy in the gift shop. I say occasionally because it was published in 1982 and there hasn't been another run of it. And I'm going to warn you, you're going to pay some good money for that. That's about a $200-300 book.
I do have a question. Does the East Broad Top run revenue freight today or now?
No,
Oh, okay.
And he plans to.
not that I'm able to discuss, aka no.
Nobody to take it to or get it from.
Yeah.
Oh.
Unfortunately, we are very much kind of isolated at the moment. Doesn't mean, it's one of those things, never say never,
True.
but
It's a possibility, but right now there's just not. There's just.
If you think my bosses are going to cut that rail going
Well, your
from Mount
bosses are about
Union to join, oh, that's right.
you're about to become Union Pacific.
But they ain't gonna do it either. Uncle Peter's gonna do it. I can tell you that. Yeah, they ain't gonna cut no branch into here, cut no junction into this.
So folks, the reason I have you gather here, one, it gives us a moment to gather outside the freight office here. But two, I get to point out a very handy prop. And that's our Pennsylvania Railroad X-29 boxcar. Folks, that was donated to us about 3 years ago from the Kiski Junction Railroad. And in May of last year, we did in fact lift it up, roll out the standard gauge truck, and roll in the narrow gauge truck. So it is a standard gauge car sitting on narrow gauge trucks. I wish I could say it took a crew of 5 guys, and it did. It did. However, it did not take 30 minutes. It took about 2 days. And the reason is we don't have the timber transfer here anymore. So as a result, it took a little bit longer. We had to hand lift it a lot. But we managed to make it work, and apparently it rolls pretty good. And as you can see, it's actively undergoing restoration. So while we never estimate when, maybe here at some point in the future, you'll see it out on a photo freight looking all nice and pretty. On that note, folks, I have a handy gravel path. So how about we use it and make like Aerosmith and walk this way?
Let's do it.
But I'll take the rear guard.
Technically the Rio Grande. Oh God. One day we're gonna have to go out west to the Denver Rio Grande stuff out there. That'd be fun. To the shop. Oh yeah.
Alrighty. Folks, I'm going to slow up a little bit just to let us gather back up, and we're going to keep moving. I said slow up, not stop.
Yeah. Indeed. Look at all them hoppers.
Well, yeah.
They have a lot, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. That's like the only hoppers. Like it was the only really good hoppers.
Indeed.
It's Colby's Railroad, Brian.
Yes, I know. Like a mine.
So folks, we're going to keep moving this way, but this is where my note about the pits very much comes to fruition.
Yeah.
If you look over my shoulder, yes, you will see a turntable, and yes, it is sitting in a turntable pit. Once again, if you are getting closer than I am getting, you are getting too close. Don't worry, you're not missing much. At the bottom there's some gravel, some dirt, some weeds, and maybe an alligator or two that I really hope Blair remembered to feed this morning on his first tour.
Yeah. Let's hope so. Also, it would be smart and fine.
Because
look.
we're heading towards the roundhouse. If you want to know more about the turntable, I'll actually be explaining it later in the tour.
Yep, old Millie. Flag. Yes.
Hand turn is one of them.
Oh, that's crazy.
Oh yeah, that's great. Good work out there.
It is.
Alrighty.
Oh, look.
And
a
folks,
cab.
we're going to pause right here for a moment. Now, folks, the reason we're pausing right here is because I need a second to address those who are like me in the audience and are vertically gifted.
Vertically.
Folks, the roundhouse, in addition to being one of those cases of railroaders being imaginative when it comes to naming things, because it's rounded and houses locomotives, was originally a garage for steam engines, which means they never really did heavy maintenance here, but they did do some light maintenance. And that light maintenance, when it was taking place, they found that the same tools were getting used in the same locations pretty much almost every single time. Well, eventually somebody wisened up to this and decided that a better idea than putting it back in a toolbox every night was to find a nail, find the nearest post, stick the nail in it, and hang the tool from it.
Oh, yeah.
As a result, if you are vertically gifted like myself, please watch your head, because you might find a nail or a tool that's been hanging there since 1956. When we walk inside, we're going to go around the right-hand side of number 12 here, down around in front of the 12, and we're going to end up between the 12 and 18, where we have a nice little tiny seating area. We ask that it's reserved for those who need it, because it's not going to hold everybody in this group, unfortunately. And we'll go over some history of the engines, and then there will be dedicated picture time. I pride myself in having that in my tours, so I ask folks that you hold your urge to get pictures until then. Alrighty? Follow me this way, folks.
Yep.
Yeah, there's nails. That's who's on it.
Yep. That's definitely like.
There's Millie.
Yep. This is definitely like a big hauler for sure. Real big size. Although, she a Mikado.
It's hilarious seeing the freaking tools just hanging up there, just chilling.
Yeah. This engine is definitely like a big hauler, but it's a Mikado version.
I love
Because it's a deckless.
Folks, keep focusing on in, please. Come around the corner here.
I like that though.
There's room enough for everybody.
Love 18.
Mm-hmm.
Thorns is there. It's already there.
Excuse me. Oh yeah.
Alrighty, folks. Welcome to the 8-stall East Broad Top Roundhouse. Originally started out as a 4-stall structure when the railroad was first built in 1873. Soon after that, they expanded it to a 6-stall structure, and then finally to an 8-stall structure that you see here today. The reason for the expansion, they were getting more locomotives, which means if you look around you, you'll actually see the reason for that expansion. And that leads me to the number 12 right here behind me. She's the 1911 product of a Baldwin Locomotive Works out in Philadelphia. And she was the first 282 Mikado steam locomotive here on the property. And that 2 at the end of 282 was rather important. Up until this point, the railroad had some 260s, 460s, 280s. And that O at the end meant that the firebox, which is the heat generating component of the boiler, had to fit between the driving wheels. Well, folks, you see the rails? Not a whole lot of space now, is it?
Nope.
So, as a result, that 2 at the end of 282 was important due to the firebox being able to sit on top of what is known as a trailing truck, which meant it could be wider as well as deeper, meaning you could get more coal in it, which meant more fire, which meant more heat, which meant more steam, which meant more power. Despite only weighing in at 55 tons, number 12 was good to haul 15 empty steel hoppers 20 miles that way up the mountain to Robertsdale. Over the course of the next 9 years, the railroad got 5 more locomotives, which was the result of the following heavily paraphrased exchange between our railroad and the Baldwin Locomotive Works. It went a little something like this, and again, this is heavily paraphrased. Dear Baldwin, we really like this engine that we bought from you. It's running really well for us. We would like another, so here's the check for another. But as you make it, could you make it bigger, please? Well, Baldwin happily obliged, because in 1912, just a year later, number 14 arrived on the property weighing in at 76 tons. And for the people looking around right now, you're not going to find 14 in here. You'll actually see her later on in our tour. A couple years later, in 1914, the railroad bought another engine. It was number 15, also weighing in at 76 tons. I wish I could say you could see 15 today, but unfortunately, she's actually hiding in stall number 6, receiving restoration work. Then finally, on June 16th, of 1916, at a cost of $16,000, folks, hopefully you've noticed the trend of number 16 by now, because that's when number 16 arrived on the property. She arrived weighing in at 86 tons, and she could haul 22 empty hoppers up to those mines in Robertsdale, which was pretty much a 50% increase from number 12 here, and about 25% increase from 14 and 15. 2 years later, in 1918, well, arrived number 17 here to the property, weighing in at the same and can haul the same. And then last but not least, our youngest engine, at least in terms of the steam locomotives, arrived in 1920, being number 18, also weighing in at 86 tons. And all of these engines were here up until the end in 1956, and it ran up until that point. And that's where the hero of our story comes into play. His name was Nick Kowalczyk of the Kowalczyk Salvage Company. And he bought the railroad with the full intention of scrapping it. How he made his money. But his son Joe tells a story that his father walked in here just as we did, saw the engines just as we do, and went, that looks a lot like the model train set I never got when I was a kid. Therefore, I'm not going to scrap the railroad. Joe goes on to say that his father was here one night, after finishing the inventory of all 33 miles of railroad he had bought. And it was late, about 11 o'clock. He was probably tired. But Joe says his father heard the engines talking to him, saying, please don't scrap us, we're not ready to say goodbye. Now, folks, whichever part of that story you choose to believe, and I choose to believe both parts of it, because as much as these are machines, they're about as human as machines can get, Nick Kowalczyk decided he was not going to scrap the railroad. And that confused some people. Namely, the organizers of the bicentennial celebration 4 years later in 1960 of Rock Hill Furnace and Orbisonia. Because they were playing the parade route through both towns, and they looked at the railroad and went, wait a minute, what gives? Nothing's missing. Well, they actually went to Nick Kowalczyk and said, would you very kindly at least display an engine for us at the crossing for the parade so we could show our kids what we used to do here, and so we could say goodbye. This is where I like to believe that Nick Kowalczyk's a big proponent of one-upmanship. Because he said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to fire up 2 of the engines, restore what few remaining passenger cars there are, and about 4.5 miles of track going out to Colgate Grove, and we're going to run tourist excursion trains for the celebration. Well, upon hearing news of that, thousands of people decided they wanted to show up. It was actually such a big deal that it ended up on later that year on Time magazine's cover. And Nick Kowalczyk very quickly realized a couple of things. Thing number 1 was people weren't ready to say goodbye to this place. And thing number 2, because thousands of people showed up, he realized he could probably make some money doing this. So from 1960 to 2011, he had the railroad opened as a tourist excursion line. About halfway through that period, upon his passing, his son Joe took over. Unfortunately, though, in 2011, the real world, in a cruel choice of fate, caught up with the railroad again. This time in the form of rising costs. That's right, costs were rising. And when I say costs were rising, I mean every cost. And due to that, Joe decided it wasn't financially feasible to operate the railroad anymore. And he shut it down for 9 years. Then Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2020 came along. That's when a group of people got together and formed what became known as the East Broad Top Foundation. And approached Joe about purchasing the railroad to restore and operate it. Joe agreed to the sale, And then the foundation actually invited him to be a member of the board, so the Kowalczyk family is still very much interested and involved with our railroad. At that point in 2020, with the help of the volunteer group known as the Friends of the East Broad Top, they're the people in the orange shirts you see running around here today. They stabilized a lot of the buildings throughout the yard complex here, actually restored that 4.5-mile line out to Colgate Grove, and then the paid mechanical staff of the foundation started digging into which of the engines was going to come back first. Now folks, I told you that all 6 of these engines ran up until the end of 1956. I'm about to tell you that 4 of these engines ran between 1960 and 2011. I tell you this, now you have context for what I'm about to say. When they were doing this evaluation, it wasn't a matter of which one was best, it was a matter of which one was least worst. Because they were all worn out. They actually found that number 16, an engine that sat out that tourist era with number 18, was in least worst condition, and set about restoring it to operation, which they did so successfully on February 1st, 2023, almost 3 years to the day of foundation ownership. On that day, 16 backed out of the roundhouse for the first time under her own power in 67 years. I don't care who you are, it's enough to bring a tear to your eye. She ran very well for us that year, holding an all-time in the entire 150-year history of the railroad record of 35,000 people. This year, she spent the first part of the year here undergoing some regularly scheduled off-season maintenance that, due to her being 109 years old, is just taking a little bit more time. And frankly, when I'm 109, I hope whatever maintenance they do to me takes whatever time it needs. However,
Agreed.
hopefully here soon, and you notice I'm knocking on a wooden pilot beam, she'll be back out pulling trains. And when that happens, I encourage you to come back and join us. Now folks, I love the steam engines. How many of you love the steam engines? A few of you? Well, because I love the steam engine so much, it means I haven't really mentioned that bus-looking thing over there.
Yeah.
Folks, that bus-looking thing over there is known as M1 or Motor 1. And frankly, if there was ever a piece of the collection that the Smithsonian was going to take for its own, it would actually be the M1 and not one of the steam engines. Reason being is the M1 is truly one of a kind. It is the only gas-electric self-propelled motor car on the narrow gauge. And yes, you heard me right, gas-electric. The engine in that thing is an aluminum block, water-cooled 6-cylinder engine, originally meant for a Zeppelin in World War I. But Brill never got that contract, so one of those motors ended up in the M1, and despite being almost 98 years old, the M1 does still operate. In fact, she ran very well for our 4th of July event, and I would encourage you to keep an eye on the website, because chances are sometime this fall she'll be out for a special occasion. I encourage you to come back for that, because it's one of the most unique rides you could ever have, and frankly, people just kind of smile different when it's in this platform. It feels like everything's right with the world. But folks, I did promise picture time. And before I give it to you, there are a few guidelines I need you to follow. It is imperative that you follow. Number 1, do not go behind the tenders of 12 and 18. The reason is, the pits are open back there and I don't want you falling in them. Additionally, behind Blair, you'll notice there's a sawhorse. Folks, stalls 4 through 8 are the domain of our wonderful mechanical department. And chances are there's a member or 2 of the team here today, meaning they might be doing some work. That also means those are active work sites and I can't let you over there. So please stay on this side of that sawhorse. Additionally, if you're taking pictures of the M1, you're more than welcome to. Just don't go on the other side of it. It's kind of a cramped storage area and I don't want anybody getting stuck. And last but not least, please do not leave the roundhouse until I gather us to leave in a few minutes. Alrighty? Otherwise, the time is yours, folks.
Yeah. Hey, I gotta say, you're doing a great job, sir. I'll do my best.
Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video.
Shiloh, here's Mud and Europe, calling away from Shiloh town. Get one long last look before you say our goodbyes, and we're hauling away from Shiloh. We're rolling this shanty block out to